I end up voting negative in this debate. I think that there's a couple of things that the affirmative should do that would help me to get the ballot. The first is that I'm not necessarily sure what within the 1AC is supposed to, make me empathize, or what about your approach causes me to actually engage the system, which is the only bits of offense that you're sort of like sitting on, is that you're a different form of engagement that's supposed to be able to have an emotional empathy, but all I hear is that it's a call to have this, but doesn't necessarily trigger anything within me. Like I don't necessarily feel emotional within the 1AC, or I don't feel that you're necessarily even engaging the structures outside of the fact that you say that you're doing. So sort of more about like, if you're going to sit on, we're able to change and we're doing something in order to change the way the status quo functions, I think that there needs to be a better explanation of how it is that you go about doing that. Otherwise, I think that if the negative wins a link story about how you would just sort of re-engage in a system that is violent, then that's a reason for why I shouldn't go ahead and endorse an approach that will just continue to fulfill the status quo. And I think that a lot of the ways that you answer the argument is defensive, especially in the 2AC, that isn't necessarily, you don't really come back from it, which is the only bit of offense that you have is that, well, they don't do things, we're at least trying to engage the system, but there isn't like, you're not fiating anything, there's not like a change, there's not like, what makes your 1AC different that is a change, that is an engagement, is the question you need to answer if that is your offense. Otherwise, when you say, well, the human is inevitable, human rights discourse is inevitable, sure, even if that's true, why should we necessarily have to engage in the way the 1AC says to engage in? And I think that when they talk about that, when you say that these people need to be granted rights and be included with the question of the human, the negative continuously gives stories about how that there are other humans who are considered not human who will then continuously be ignored within the system. So that way there might be some people who are oppressed and tortured, but the only reason why we want to stop this or have this emotional connection is because we can finally see them as human. And then when we encounter others who we don't see as human, then we continue to exploit them because they don't have that, and then we're back to the same spot where we're like, well, now we need another affirmative to say that these new individuals are then human. And the 2AR says, some things in terms of that make that sort of clear to me, like where you start saying that we need to give these individuals human rights so that way we can recognize them as being human, so we can stop torturing these individuals, right? Which means that you're talking about specific individuals that we have to recognize as being human, opposed to even like trying to extend the notion of the human to all humans. Is very specific to a specific location, to a specific group of individuals who are being tortured. That doesn't speak to other individuals who are being tortured. And that's something I think the negative could do more on when you get into sort of like the question of like white supremacy, and like the 2NC talks a little bit about like the black female as a way to be like, those are oppressions and violence that's experienced that aren't really talked about, and because those aren't tortured in the traditional sense of torture in the way that the affirmative is talking about it. So I would sort of like, when you are explaining your link stories, explain what it means for when they say torture and the spectacle. What are the spectacles that are being put on torture that we're creating this emotional connection with? It isn't the torture or the violence that happens in the everyday walking down the street for some people, but rather it's the torture of those people who are indefinitely detained in the traditional sense of what the resolution is traditionally meant to understand of what is detention. I think that will make clear the individuals who are going to then be excluded within their approach that they never get about to, because they're like, well, once we have that emotional connection, then we'll be able to take into account emotionality everywhere. But I mean, you could then give examples of where that's not the case. And I think that it would help the affirmative if you give examples where emotion has helped to actually stop forms of violence, where once we have an emotional connection that's caused us to not just stop that individual form of violence, but that way it's then snowballed to stop other forms of violence as well. So that way you could say that, like, even if we might not be a perfect step, and even if we're just a small step in the right direction, that small step will snowball, opposed to just sort of being like, well, at least we're not the status quo, at least we're not the status quo. Because that's not necessarily an incredibly persuasive argument in the world, where I think that there are others that could be potentially even further excluded as a result of it, that will then cause other forms of violence to take place. And I think that you need to locate offense against what they're doing. I think it's tricky because after cross-examination of the 1NC, the alternative is reject. But in the 2NC, 1NR, 2NR, it seems clear that the alternative is not just reject. You give a bunch of options of what else it could be. So I would say that, I wouldn't phrase it as, when they say what's the alternative, I wouldn't be like, our alternative is just to reject, because there's a lot more that's going on there, and you don't want to be like pigeonholed to be like, well, we're just a reject alternative. Like, the alternative, I would say, is the entirety of the 1NC's performance, right? You are a criticism of what they've done. Your alternative is to criticize the way that emotion is being utilized as a way to put the spectacle as respectacularized. And then when the 2NC, 1NR explain things like the way that voices could have been inserted into this round by reading narratives, or voices could have been another. You don't have to defend narratives as an example, but then it shows that your criticism shows that there's tons of alternatives that could have been done, and it's not your obligation to come up with an alternative, but your obligation to criticize the flawed maneuvering of the affirmative, which is reject the affirmative. But when you say in cross-examination clearly our alt is just reject, I don't think that's actually what you're doing come the later portions of the debate. And I think that
have been better for me to just like assume that it wasn't just reject and make it from like obviously I shouldn't make a permutation, but like would it be better for me to tweak the alt as like not just rejecting, or hold them to the cross-exam answer?
Yeah, one or the other. I think that anyone who says reject, even if they have like written down like our alternative to reject the app, is never just reject. It's always that rejection then does something that is better, or some sort of sense, right? So you should, assume like what that could potentially turn into. And yeah, have a permutation, but when they say clearly the alt is just reject, then you should be like, well, I didn't have a permutation because we can't perm rejection, but I think that would at least allow me for the 1AR to come up with permutations about, narratives that could have been utilized or whatnot. And with a minute left over in the 1AR, that's a perfect time to be like, well, we don't know what else to do. Maybe it's a time to read one of those stories that they say is in the evidence that you're actually reading, but you choose not to read that. And I would almost make that even more explicit, that the books that they're reading has these forms of approaches, but then they decided to turn it into a debate argument, compartmentalize those parts that can make cards from those parts that can't make cards. So the author thinks that it's important for these voices to be heard. They think it's important for us to have the emotion, but then don't take the parts that allow us to have that emotional connection in there. Shows to me like the affirmatives approach is one that actually removes the voices from the round even further, because had I just been told read this book, I would have gotten the voices, but the way it's being presented denies that. So I would almost like have a bigger conversation about what it means for them to produce their affirmative in the way that they produce that knowledge production in that way, and I think that would be explicit. But I'd also definitely be like, listen, they said reject, it's clearly not reject. Here's our reasons for why, how, and then you could be like, they say narratives are potential. Now you can maybe read offense against narratives, or they say this, and like they're not going to defend those as options because they're just throwing out here's our potentials that you could do. But then you could start being like, well, now there's some potential offense that you could start beginning to point to in the flow, opposed to just they refuse to engage with the system, which may or may not be true, but I'm not sure why they're not engaging the system and you're with an engagement of the system. Like that argument makes more sense a little bit to me in the world where it's like a traditional policy app, because we're like, well, we're trying to do policy making, but you're not trying to do policy making, so then I'm not sure what sort of engagement of the system that you're doing is different than their engagement with the system. So I think you need to flesh out that argument a little bit more in order to actually, show me how that is. And I would also, like on the negative side, I would be like, we are an engagement with the system. When we criticize you, that is engaging with the system directly. We're not throwing out human rights discourse. We are interrogating the way the human rights discourse is being utilized. If we just assert human rights unproblematically, it's going to create all these flaws. The only way that it makes sense is for us to interrogate human rights discourse. And so in order to sort of leverage against like a permutation that may have emerged, like you could also phrase your criticism as a counterperm. You aren't against the entirety of the affirmative. You aren't against the entirety of the use of human rights or human discourse, but you're against the articulation that allows for emotion to be established purely from an individual's claim to humanity, or an individual's claim to be spoken and to be heard about. And so that way it's like, yeah, we agree these people shouldn't be detained and shouldn't be tortured, but the argument is not about that. The argument is about how do we engage with these systems. So sort of what the affirmative does, I think the negative did that clearer, and then if there was a permutation, you would have essentially already permed those portions of the affirmative you've agreed with and put the disagreement on a very specific place. Because I think that if there was offense against what you were doing more clearly, I think that you'd be potentially in a dangerous situation in the world of them being able to be like, well, we're not the traditional approach we're sort of criticizing and sort of moving in this direction, and if you aren't in engagement with the system, which I don't hear a direct saying that we are in engagement with the system, then it's like, well, maybe we have to engage the system, but there's, that requires also some additional offense for why your approach is bad. So I think that having that would, explaining what you do of theirs is beneficial versus not beneficial. I also like their argument that value exists independent of someone recognizing the value existing. It doesn't take the master to say the slave has value, or the slave has value, whether or not the master chooses to have that emotional reaction or that emotional connection to them. And then, it becomes a question of what do we do? And I think that sometimes the affirmative comes down to is like, if we don't hear and we don't establish an emotional connection to these individuals, and these individuals have no value, and then they're able to be tortured, opposed to a more nuanced approach to that is like, if we don't recognize the emotional connection we have with the others, that it's not that they have no value, but then we construct them, or that the master constructs them as having no value. And once the master constructs them as having no value, then the master does not care about what way they treat them. But then also, like, you know, masters did give value to the slaves. They were a utility to be used to, like, for labor and, you know, free labor in that sense, right? So it's a question of not giving value one way or the other to groups who are oppressed, but a recognition of that giving value is not something that can be given, because as soon as, like, someone says I have the power to give someone else value, then you're already turning that someone else into an object who only is meaningful because you've given it value, opposed to recognizing the intrinsic value to the individual that exists, and now put the onus on the individual, the master, or the individual, the oppressor, to say, now, how do I constitute my own value? And if the constitution of my own value is coming from the relationship that's established, that's one where it's not about the oppressed being the object, but is the way that the oppressor recognizes the subjective engagement with the oppressed in a way that allows the oppressor to reconstitute their own identity in relationship to it, opposed to a situation where the oppressor gives value or gives identity to the oppressed. And I think that the negative approach seems to allow for the oppressed, tortured bodies to be able to come to the forefront better, because it means that it's not about my emotional spark or the oppressor's emotional spark, but that there's already value that's endowed there. And then that to me seems like a prerequisite in order for us to be able to have emotion, is to be able to recognize, to have those voices or bodies present from the get-go. So that's sort of how I, you know, come around to making my decision. And again, I think that, you know, the biggest thing that needs to happen for you all is sort of explain what the app does, that does the things that you say are beneficial. Because without that, it's tough to be able to figure out how voting affirmative solves for anything or moves us in the right direction. And then I think that the negative does a good job of saying what it is that you're doing towards the end. And I think that what you all could be improving on is doing more of capturing portions of what they're saying. Like the affirmative oftentimes says, like, we're a prerequisite, we have to have emotional connection for them to be, for, you know, the tortured body to come into the round. And I think that you could be like, no, we're the ones who actually allow the tortured bodies to come into the round, and emotion can only come as after I do the flip of that. And so I think that you can make your argument more specific to how you solve for the affirmative approaches, more than you actually end up doing in the context of the round, because you're just sort of like, they're bad, which is true, and you know, and that's what you win on. But I think that it could be easier for you if you're also like, not 100% of them is bad. This is a small disagreement. This is how we solve for everything else. So that way, if there is a permutation, it doesn't matter. Or if there is offense, you still are able to weigh the elements of the app that you solve plus the offense. So that way, it's not just like neg versus app, but the neg is also an embodiment of portion of the app. And I think that would make it easier for, you know, around where some of the other things are contested, for you to be able to win those claims.
This is our first time reading this app. Do you have any suggestions for it? Just like not necessarily the context around, but just the one you see, or
the one I see, I mean, I think that a narrative or a poem or something that allows the judge or the people in the round to actually have an emotional connection is imperative if your argument is about establishing that emotional connection. Otherwise, I'm not sure how it's not just like card, right? And so that would be a way that I would structure the one I see, so that way there is some sort of performative element to it. Because absent that performative element, I'm not really sure how you would be able to gain access to some of the things that you're doing. And so that
argument that, like, the spectacle is just out there in the world, and the question of how we engage like that.
Right, what spectacle though? Like, are you relying on my knowledge of what happened in Abu Ghraib and in Guantanamo and what I've seen on the news or stuff like that? Like, is the spectacle the news media reports that I've seen, or is the spectacle their own voices? Like, what is the spectacle that I'm specifically located at? And then how are you actually countering those forms of spectacles? Right? If I'm just like looking at it, be like, oh, that was horrible. These people were tortured. I feel so bad for them. How is that? Most people watch the news and was like, this is atrocious, I have an emotional connection. Even if they might be terrorists or bad guys, these are still people that shouldn't be treated this way. And so there was like an emotional outpour of like, how can we torture people like this? But in my mind, it didn't really change anything. So like, you're obviously not just like, let's put these news reports out here of tortured individuals. You're obviously a different form of recreating the spectacle, but I'm not sure what is that new spectacle that we create, even if there's sort of a recreation of it. And to me, I think like, having someone who speaks about being there could be a new form of spectacle that allows us to have that emotion. Because the people who were tortured in detention sites, their voices still weren't heard. Their photos were shown. So then it became that disaster pornography that, you know, both teams are sort of talking about, because like, look at that. Now I feel emotional because people shouldn't be treated that way. But I never actually get to understand those people as people, because I never actually hear those people speak. And so that's the problem, in my view, of these news reports, is that the voices of the people being oppressed are never actually brought to the foreground. And I think that if you bring those voices to the foreground, then it becomes much easier for people to have that sort of emotional connection. And so then your criticism of the way the spectacle is currently presented out in news media, and then your presentation is not like, we just have to have emotion, but here's a way that we could effectively establish emotion through a new way of creating representation and new forms of discourse along those lines. All right. Other questions?
Thank you.
All right. Thanks for debating.